Okay, we're going to finish chapter 26. This section focuses on the growth of nationalism in Asia and Africa. Um, and eventually, nationalist movements in Africa and India will actually lead to decolonization. So this is where we're first introduced to Gandhi, and here's an image of Gandhi leading one of his marches, protest marches. I believe this is the Salt March. So, the Ottoman Empire, we go back to the gunpowder empires, if you recall. It's an Islamic empire. By the end of World War One, it kind of is done. They are part of the Central Powers. The Central Powers lose World War One, and as a result, the empire is broken up. The empire itself is going to be under British control as a result of that, and under British control, you're going to have a nationalist movement. Remember, nationalism we saw it in Italy, we saw it in Germany, where the people kind of come together to unite and basically seek independence, right? Or at least in Italy and Germany, they sought to form their own nation, right? So that's the idea: is forming your own nation. And this idea of self-determination, where they wanted to determine their own government free of British control. So the leader who kind of led this movement was Mustafa Kemal. That's him right there. He defeats the British in 1921, and the nation of Turkey emerges, right? So that's out of the Ottoman Empire. And he kind of continues what we saw in the last unit, where this part of the world is slowly westernizing. He establishes a secular government where, even though it's an Islamic nation, the church and the state are going to be separated, right? Secularism. He's going to promote public education for girls and boys, suffrage for women. So, major changes in this part of the world under Mustafa. He's going to abolish polygamy. And as you can see in his image, he wore Western suits and hats as a symbol of that change. So I think he's important to remember. You can make connections to Peter the Great. You can make connections to what was happening in Japan, right? The continued westernization of worlds that were traditional, right? And he has moved that part of the world to, again, a new phase, economically, politically, and culturally. Still going to be an Islamic region, no doubt. Turkey today is a country dominated by the religion of Islam. India. So we mentioned the Indian National Congress, right? India was a colony of England, and the Indian National Congress emerges in the late 1800s to really, again, promote nationalism, right? Push England out. And I think it's a really important entity. It's an example of anti-colonial resistance. One really important event that kind of solidified their strength and power was the Amritsar massacre in 1919. Really tragic event. The British had made it illegal to have public gatherings. The British really limited travel of Indians in India. You had to have special passports. There was a lack of rights for the Indian people. So, they do end up gathering at a public garden to protest the arrest of some of their freedom fighters. And it's at that massacre where 300 protesters are killed by the English military. I mean, really a horrific event. And what that did is it helped unify the people of India for this independence movement. Kind of think about the Boston Massacre and the American Revolution. This was even worse, obviously. That was, I think, 13 colonists who were killed, 300 protesters. It's during this time that Mohandas Gandhi emerges as a powerful figure. He was actually educated in the West, in England, so he did benefit from that in a sense. But he obviously pushed for independence, but he promoted civil disobedience. This idea of unjust laws. It's okay to break unjust laws. It's okay to disobey civilly, right? So he promoted nonviolent resistance. He was very influential in terms of what Martin Luther King learned. He encouraged the people of India to boycott British goods, right? Punish the British economy. Don't buy those things. Remember, the industries of India were decimated by the English monopolies, the textile monopolies in England. So England would end up, taking cotton from India, manufacturing it in England and then selling it back at high prices to the people of India. People of India said, let's just make our own cloth. He even encouraged them to make their own salt because England wouldn't allow them to make their own salt. They had to buy English salt, for example. So he ended up in a protest march bringing protesters to the Indian Ocean to make their own salt. So great examples of that. Again, this is a colonial resistance movement. Definitely be familiar with the Congress and then obviously Gandhi and civil disobedience. It's also during this time where leaders of India, some leaders were promoting a two-state solution. The challenge that India faced is that you had a Muslim population and a Hindu population. The Hindu population was larger, but that was an issue going forward. How would you unite a country that was so different religiously speaking? So some believe that a Muslim state should emerge and then a Hindu state. And in a sense, that was created later on, where Pakistan was carved out of India and that became a Muslim state. Today, Pakistan is mostly Muslim. India became the Hindu state. That doesn't mean that Muslims don't live in India, but the governments were dominated by Hindus and Muslims. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, another Muhammad Ali, he promoted that separate state. He was always concerned that Muslims would never be represented in the Indian government. And again, eventually the two-state solution did emerge. Very important piece. I've seen it on past tests. The partition of India, the separation of India into two separate nations. And that's going to happen down the road, but it's during the early 1900s where that is discussed. There's also an independence movement in Africa emerging. Again, anti-colonial resistance. It's the Negritude movement. It occurs or develops in French West Africa. It emphasizes black pride, African nationalism. It rejects French colonial authority in West Africa, and it was led by African intellectuals who, like Gandhi, were educated in Europe. So these are all examples, I think, of anti-colonial movements in the early 1900s, the Negritude movement. Probably a fact to put on a flashcard, for example. Neo-colonialism. So neo is kind of new. So the United States also, they're in the business of colonialism. It goes back to the annexation of Hawaii and the annexation of Philippines, the acquisition of Cuba and the Puerto Rico during the Spanish-American War, the building of a canal. All of those are great examples of American colonialism. But we weren't necessarily dominating foreign nations like India was, but we had a lot of influence. We were, in many cases, indirectly controlling those governments. So Howard Taft promoted a policy known as dollar diplomacy. His goal was, let's have as much American investment in Latin America, maybe not govern those countries, but have a lot of say in their economies. The idea was, let's exploit the wealth and resources of the Caribbean before Europe does. And U.S. investments during this time totaled $2 billion. So we were building roads, hospitals, American businesses were developing in that part of the world. Maybe down the road, we'd see the emergence of hotels in Cuba, things like that. We actually used military intervention in both Haiti and the Dominican Republic. In the Dominican, it was interesting. We took control of their economy. We started to collect taxes. Our concern was that the Dominican Republic owed a lot of money to the European powers, and the European powers, we believe, were going to want that money back, and the fear was that Europe would come in and take over the Dominican Republic. Maybe it'd be France or England, whoever the Dominican Republic owed more money to. So the idea was, let's control that economy, let's help them pay back those loans and keep Europe out of the Americas. So again, you don't need to know this specifically, but provide some examples of American interventionism or expansionism or colonialism during this period. And again, dollar diplomacy was more of a policy, right? Invest in Latin America, build American businesses, right? Sell American goods to these markets, and in some cases, use the military to protect those economies from European takeover. All right, that's it, guys. Work on the next test, Chapter 26 quiz, that'll be due on Monday.